Hi, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to MBA Spotlight 2021.
Really excited to be here with all of the lovely panelists here as well, and hoping to answer as many questions as possible for you guys.
I think as long as you're eager to learn, you have a growth mindset, you'll be completely fine.
I wouldn't rush to apply in round one if you're not going to have an amazing application in round two.
We don't consider age as part of your MBA application. We're looking at students who have demonstrated leadership potential and who have had an impact.
We know it's a process that requires a lot of work from your end, so whatever we can do to help guide you through it, we're really here for it.
Greetings. So first off, does anybody have any questions about where they are in the process of studying and time management during the test or anything? We can kind of gather those right now, and then I can address them either throughout the talk or at the end. I'll wait a moment or two to see if any comments gather. Otherwise, we'll dive in. So yeah, in terms of time management in the test, this is one of the most common questions that students have. There are different scales, time scales, on which to consider time management. There's over your entire GMAT journey. Then there's within the individual test sections, and then within individual questions. And we'll kind of zoom to different levels throughout the talk. As far as for the big picture, so we're coming up on the round 2 deadline next month. And so we have a question about RC there. Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. And it's one of the more challenging sections to do time management on. So in terms of the big picture, so we're coming up on round 2. So many of you will hit your target before then, and congratulations. Many will also find that difficult and may need to extend a little bit. That's fine. I mean, the important part is that you're working now, and then you're that much farther ahead from when you do finish. So in terms of how much time it takes to reach your target, it really depends on where you're starting and what you're aiming for, and then also how much time you can study. Some people are working full time and can only study maybe an hour a day. Others are able to study 5 or 6 hours a day. I don't recommend studying, if someone's able to study all day, every day, I don't recommend doing, say, 8 or 10 or 12 hours, because that tends to not be very sustainable. Maybe people can do a day or 2 of that, but then they kind of get tired of studying. So it's better to be balanced and, maybe do 5 hours at most if you have a full-time availability to study. And then if you're able to do an extra hour or so, great, but it's good to be conservative and underestimate. Whatever amount of time you think that you have, it's best to estimate slightly less than that. So people who are studying self-study without any outside help, something like getting 20 points in a month is fairly typical. You may be able to exceed that. You may be close to your score and kind of plateau, and it may take longer to get those final 20 points. But it really depends. If you're particularly ambitious, you may be able to get more points. Some people will get 100 points in a month. That's kind of rare. Often it's because they might have bombed the first test, and so their real score is actually higher than that anyway. But a conservative estimate is that with a tutor, you might be able to get 50 points in a month. And that really depends on your progress and how much study you're able to do. But that's just kind of, these are ballpark figures just to kind of get a sense of time management. And as far as, most students they're not starting out at 700. So it can usually take anywhere from 2 to 6 months to study. If you're able to do it in 2 weeks or that's great. That's probably not the case for most people. But no matter where you're starting, if it shouldn't take more than 6 months. I mean, that's kind of the upper limit. If it's taking longer than that, you'll want to do something different. So, I mean, maybe if you're starting from 400 and you're trying to get above 700 and you don't have the help of a tutor, it may take longer than 6 months. It'll be a pretty long and arduous path, but it's definitely possible. But yeah, most people if they're taking longer than 6 months to reach their score, there's something they're not doing right in their study, whether that's studying the wrong materials or the wrong difficulty level. It could be they're just bad task taking strategies. There could be any number of things. So if you're not progressing at this pace, this approximate pace I've outlined here, it's probably best to seek some outside counsel. You can ask people in GMAT Club, you can contact a private tutor, whatever works. So in terms of common pitfalls that people have, one is that life happens, people get busy with their work, maybe they want a break from studying, so they take a vacation, they go somewhere fun, whatever, and then when they come back, they kind of don't feel like studying. So consistency is key. It's better to do a little bit every day versus trying to do a marathon, one weekend and then kind of dropping off for like a week or two or a month. So the fable of the tortoise versus the hare, it's better to be the tortoise and just steadily increasing those gains. Even if you feel like you can be going faster, it's better to just be going at all. And then over time that accumulates and compounds. But yeah, a lot of students will do the kind of sporadic study and then kind of burn out. And in some ways, I mean, it's better than nothing. But on the other hand, it's almost the taking long breaks off can undo a lot of that progress. When students when they go for more than like 3 days or so without study, they tend to forget the things that they learned even as recently as 3 days ago. So any longer than a couple days off, you start to slowly forget things. You can rapidly regain them too, but that's extra work that you have to do. That adds time. So that the time of not studying plus the time of having to relearn things. So it's better to just keep that steady progress, steady momentum, and let that carry you through your studies. Another thing that slows people down is, when they're studying or taking the test, is that they don't sleep enough. And trying to answer these challenging GMAT questions when, let's say, you've only gotten 4 hours or maybe even 6 hours of sleep, you might be able to make some progress, but it's the more well rested you are, the faster you can learn, and also the faster you can execute in the test. So it's really important that you're getting plenty of sleep every single day. Exercise can help. If you have insomnia, maybe get earplugs if it's noisy. But sleep is one of the most common things that students neglect. And it's not really a place you can cut corners. So it's important to get plenty of rest. Another thing that, as far as time management in the test, that's really helpful is, so let's say you learn some new strategy in math or in whatever subject, and then you're trying to practice on a problem, or you count a problem on the test, and you're somewhat familiar with this new method, and you remember it, but it's not quite second nature. You want to be able to execute almost from muscle memory. It has to be basically a reflex that you see the question, you know what to do. And that just comes from many hours of study and practice. There's no substitute for that. It's good to be able to think on the fly and just be able to wing it, essentially, because you never know what you're going to encounter in the test. But at the same time, there's a limited number of topics that are in the test. So if you've done them all and you master as many as you can, it's better to just be able to do it by reflex. So, and also, it's important to time yourself for every single question, because oftentimes students might time themselves for the section, like maybe 62 minutes for quant, 65 for verbal, but they don't have a sense of what does an actual minute feel like when I'm doing a question, or what do 2 minutes feel like. So you need to keep a spreadsheet that for every single question that you do, and time yourself so that you know exactly, what is 30 seconds. I mean, 30 seconds in everyday life feels different than 30 seconds when you're in the GMAT taking the test. So it's really important to be familiar with what 30 seconds is when you're working on a question, based on how much you've written, how far into the question, reading you've gotten, or solving it. So you want to time yourself on every single question. And then when you do a question, maybe it's over the time limit, that's fine in study mode. I mean, it's kind of rare that you're able to do every question or most questions under the time limit the first time. So for the ones that are over the time limit that you get incorrect, you want to fix whatever mistakes or identify whatever improvements you could make on that, and then redo the question blank, like without referencing your notes or anything, and time yourself doing that again, and just essentially iterate that until you're within the time target. Oftentimes what students do when they study is they'll just do the question one time, they see the answer, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, I got that, and that's it. But then they don't solidify that by repeating that question from scratch without looking at anything, no notes, no anything, just doing it completely again anew, and then making sure they hit the time target. So it's not enough to just kind of understand that you have to do it in the time target again until you're able to do it in the time target. And if you get stuck on something, just gather those questions up and ask someone else, or bring to a tutor, or whatever you need to do. So as far as a couple of myths, well, actually first, are there any questions? Any more questions? We're going to get to the RC question in a bit, but I'll give you a moment to, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat, in the comments. So in terms of timing on the entire test, there's this common myth that, let me go back to that window. There's this myth that you can essentially play with timing and game the algorithm somehow, that maybe if you just spend less time on the first questions, more on the last, or vice versa, spend more time on the first questions and then not as much on the others, that you'll be able to defeat the algorithm somehow, because of the difficulty level is ramping up. And so as long as you don't miss those easy questions in the first part, that you'll be able to kind of secure your score. That's maybe slightly true, but there's only certain circumstances where it's actually going to help, and that's if you're essentially aiming for like a perfect score. Because if you miss any easy questions, that'll kind of destroy your chances of getting a perfect score, but you can still get a high score. But most people aren't aiming for a perfect score. They're aiming for, let's say, a 720, maybe a 750. As long as you're not missing easy questions, that's the more important part. You don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on any subset of questions and then leave out time on the other questions if you could be missing. If you run out of time and you have to miss easier questions than your real ability, that's also going to damage your score. So it's more important to be fairly consistent for most people, and just try not to miss the easiest questions, or even the medium questions, because that will limit your score, since it's looking at the difficulty level of the questions that you answer. So, and then another one is within individual sections, that a certain percentage of the questions counts more to your score. This is kind of the same myth or a related myth, but it's not actually. It's not these questions themselves that are weighed more heavily. It's that the difficulty is ramping up, and if you miss easy questions in that first part, that'll affect your score. So it's more about the difficulty level of the questions themselves, and not so much about where they are on the test. Unless you're going for a perfect score, then that's slightly different. So, and then within the level of individual questions, there are plenty of hacks or kind of shortcuts to answering questions that you can employ. However, you got to be careful that GMAT actually knows what we're doing. How people are responding to the questions, and they might build counters to that in the question. So, for example, in sentence correction, we might identify splits in the answer choices, and we might identify that, okay, this verb needs to be plural because this subject is plural. So we look through all the answer choices and we look for plural verbs, but they know that we're doing this because they study how we study. So the approach is pretty meta, and they might change the subject in a different answer choice. So we're looking for plural verbs, but they might change the subject into a singular. And then if we're only too focused on the plural verb, we'll miss that question by trying to use the splits hack. So we still have to consider the whole answer choice in the full context. And we can't just have tunnel vision. On the flip side, sometimes tunnel vision can be helpful. For example, in critical reasoning, oftentimes students will think outside the scope of the question and answer something that sounds relevant. They'll select an answer that sounds like it is relevant and important, or it doesn't answer the specific question that they're asking. So we have to be careful to stay within a certain scope. Sometimes, and the scope changes depending on the question. So we have to adapt based on whatever they're asking us. And the time that we spend per question can vary quite a bit. Some questions, we might see an easy math question that we can answer in under 30 seconds. And we might see a really challenging one that takes 3 minutes. It really depends on our own abilities and then what question they're giving us. So we can't necessarily stick to exactly 2 minutes a question. That's more of a global metric. But over time, we can kind of, in quant, you can essentially just whatever question you're on, just double that for how many minutes should have passed. And you can also make a timetable that at each question, how much time should have passed. So you can do it by quarters, and then every 15, or let's say every 9 questions, for example, in verbal, you can get a table for that can help. So 3 minutes is about the max you want to spend per question, and even that is pretty rare. Just the average wouldn't work out if many of them were 3 minutes. You can really only do a few questions at 3 minutes. Probably no more than 2 or 3 at the very max, because then they'll start taking time from other questions. That's an extra minute, which if you have 3 of those, that's 3 minutes. That's like a question and a half, basically. That's the less that you can do. So that'll trim corners and decrease performance and other questions. So you only want to do that a few times, because even in terms of very difficult questions, if your score is above 45, you're still not going to see that many difficult questions. The extreme difficult, the highest difficulty. There might be at most like 3 per test, maybe 2 of the very difficult to solve within a few minutes difficulty. Most of them are going to be at that medium level. easy, medium, and a few difficult. So 2 minutes should be appropriate. And if you struggle with the 2 minutes, then there might be other things to work on. For example, speed math or familiarity with the different verbal types. We can get into that. So in terms of, also I forgot to mention, when you start a quant question, usually well, it depends on how familiar you are with the topic. You might read it and immediately know what to do and start working on that as soon as you finish reading it. Sometimes you might have to puzzle over it for a little bit, and then what exactly are they asking, or how can I set this up algebraically, or what method should I use? Should I draw a graph, or should I make a table? But there might be situations in which you encounter a question and then you read it and then you're still not entirely sure how to even start it. So if you reach, let's say, the 30-second mark and you're not quite sure what you need to do to even work on the question, you've written some stuff, but you're not sure where to go, then it's time to pivot into other methods, indirect methods. So sometimes, rather than trying to write an equation and solve it out that way, or even however they present the information, sometimes they present it to you in a way that's not exactly helpful to solve. You may have to rearrange things or write one variable in a different way than they presented it to you, or in terms of different information. So if you're at the 30-second mark and you're not quite sure what you need to do to start or to finish, even to begin finishing, that's when you might switch into using other methods. Like you might estimate that'll save time. At least you can get down to 2 choices, perhaps, and then you can think about, well, this one's too much, this one's too little, so I estimated downwards, so probably it's the greater number. Things like that. You can substitute the answer choices depending on the type of question and see how that works in the question, if it makes sense. Or you can maybe plug in some numbers. If they gave you things in terms of variables, you can substitute numbers in, see how that works out. It really depends on the type of question. But even these methods, sometimes they're even faster than solving it directly anyway. I recommend trying to solve things directly unless you look at it and see, oh, this algebra is going to be pretty tedious, or the numbers aren't really friendly, so it's going to take a long time. Then sometimes it's better to just dive right into the indirect methods to get to the answer. So the indirect methods sometimes end up being the more direct method. But yeah, basically, sometimes you have to do it directly with explicitly solving, and sometimes you have to use the roundabout way. It really depends on the type of question. And getting that sense comes from doing many questions and just trying different methods to solve even the same problem. So one thing to do that's good in practice in math is to use multiple methods to solve the same question. Sometimes you can use 3 or 4 different ways to do it. You might be able to make a table of answers. You might be able to substitute the answer choices, draw a graph. You can estimate rounding up or down, and then basically answer choices. Many different ways. So it's good to. Sometimes students are more comfortable with a certain way or few ways of solving questions, and they're not able to necessarily tie things together and be interdisciplinary, or a multimodal approach, take a multimodal approach. So then it's good to, especially for the really difficult questions, to be able to think in different ways and have multiple perspectives on the same problem, because sometimes it's actually necessary to do that, to piece together. You might have to start with a graph on one part and then switch into thinking about inequalities, and then substitute the answer choices at the final step, because you have then 2 choices, for example. So it's good to have multiple methods and sometimes to combine them even within the same question. So another thing about quant that students often struggle with in terms of timing is, even though they're able to answer difficult questions, maybe it takes them 5 minutes to do, because there is certain core fundamental math that they know how to do, but they never got super fast at it, or maybe they did back in high school or whatever, but they just kind of forgot it, or middle school, whatever. So, for example, basic things like multiplication hacks and division hacks, like instead of, if you want to multiply by 5, it's easier to just multiply by 10 and then just half the number, rather than actually doing 5 times, let's say doing 5 times 34. You don't want to do 5 times 4 or 5 times 30, add it. You can, it's fine. It's easier to just half of 34 to 17 and then times it by 10. There are a lot of little things like that. Same thing for division. If you want to divide by, if you want to divide by 5, you can just divide by 10 and then double it. Things like that. Adding fractions. We all know how to do that. I mean, with the multiple, you find the least common denominator. But there are a lot of shortcuts within that save time. And same thing with percents, knowing some baseline percentages and then kind of knowing whether to go up or down for that. Students often just forget basic percents like 1/8, things like that. So it's important to, if you're doing a question and it's over the time limit, but you know how to do it, identify those places where you could either skip a step. Maybe you didn't have to write this full equation down again. You could have just crossed out a certain part of it. Identify places where you can save time and practice like we do in the question with whatever shortcut you identify. Oftentimes students will write too much, or they may write too little. They're trying to do too much mentally, and they're juggling too much information at once simultaneously. So it's better to write a little bit more. It really depends on the context and the specific question. And also your own ability to do mental math or to do things without writing them. But what I recommend is always err on the side of writing a little too much. And then if you notice that you didn't have to write that much, then when you do the practice, then identify places where you can skip a step, especially writing out the full equation multiple times. That takes time. It even though it makes things a little clearer, you might be able to avoid that. And only write things. Let's say you write 7 lines to solve a question. You might be able to actually just write 4 lines. There might be shorthands and abbreviations that you could use that would actually save quite a bit of time without sacrificing accuracy or making you have to keep track of more. So that's something to definitely pay attention to. So anyway, in terms of the speed math and neglecting speed math, this causes problems for students, even if they have their quant scores in the mid-40s. Sometimes it can cause problems because for multiple reasons. One is making your study take longer. Every single question you do, if you're faster on all these core fundamental math operations that you're going to be doing in every question, that adds up over every single question you do in your study. So that might end up, if you added it all up, little things like these multiplication hacks, ways to deal with square roots, whatever, all this the basic math part. If you were to add that all up, it can add up to dozens of hours total of study, depending on how much you're studying. So it's really important to get all the low-hanging fruit, these easy things that you can have. So it also creates problems because it takes more time to solve each question, which in the test, time is crucial. Every second counts. And then, of course, if the speed math is an issue, it'll be impossible to solve these very difficult questions within the time target for the entire test, because maybe taking extra time here may result in losing time somewhere else. So there might be this lower score plateau. So it's important to take care of that. And then in terms of verbal, so in math, it's a little easier to do time management because it's just 2 minutes a question. But in verbal, it's a little more challenging because when you divide it out, it's not a round number. So you can't really keep track of that in the time target. I mean, during the test for individual questions. So it's better to think a little more globally. 5 questions every 9 minutes is a lot easier to to keep track of in terms of time. And also the different questions are they're weighted differently. So sentence correction, critical reasoning, and RC, there are more sentence correction questions, but they also take less time typically. So you want to be careful about if you spend too much time on SC, especially if English is a person's second language, they might take a little more time than they should on sentence correction questions. And that because it's more questions, these numbers might need to be adjusted, but because I wrote this a while ago, but even though it's a higher percentage of the questions, it's going to, that multiplies out to be more time if you spend more time than necessary. And then critical reasoning, even though it's the fewest, they tend to take the longest because they're just denser, more to process. So you want to be careful about time management there. But you can, if you see a CI question, you can use a 2-minute timer on that one, and just kind of safely, so it's easier to anchor time for that. And then reading comprehension, someone had asked about this earlier. The time limit for that, it depends on the passage, because some passages will only have maybe one paragraph, just a lengthy paragraph, and some passages have 4 paragraphs, and it just takes a while to read through. So, and also sometimes students will read way too fast because they're concerned about time, and they spend extra time on the questions. But then they end up having to reread the passage anyway multiple times. So it's better to do a depth read at the very beginning for the passage. Essentially, you want to invest that time up front. And even though it might feel like you're losing time on the questions, you'll actually gain that time with a deeper understanding of the passage. And it'll make the questions go a little faster if you know the passage a little more deeply. So if it's one paragraph, it's a good idea to take even 2 minutes, just read it really deeply, really thoroughly understand it, or 1.5 minutes, something like that. And if you're reading it kind of fast and casually, you might actually see, it might seem like, oh, this is just 30 seconds to read that passage, but you'll want to actually dive a little deeper than that, because you have that time anyway. That often, it really depends on your score. Like some people, they're scoring higher in RC or they're scoring lower, but most students, the vast majority of students, need to slow down and read the passage a lot more deeply, and then so they can use it in the questions. And then in the questions, maybe 70 to 80 seconds a question. So you'll make up that time in the questions. The extra time you spend reading the passage, you save in the questions. So, and then another thing to do is when you're in the verbal section, it's good to write this A, B, C, D, E thing to keep track of your answer choices, because having to mentally keep track of, okay, I eliminated A, then you go through the answer choices, then you might forget which one you eliminated. Maybe you forget, was it A or B? I forget. So it's better to just offload or download that onto the page, the scratch pad, and write, maybe when you get to A, you eliminate A, and then maybe get to B, and then even if you're pretty sure it's B, you still don't want to put a check mark or circle it or whatever, because oftentimes they'll make an answer sound like it's the correct one. Something about it, maybe it sounds more specific or it sounds more relevant. Maybe it's just easier to understand. It's more concrete, the language. But they built a trap into it somehow. So it's better to, if you think it's right, still put a question mark. And then maybe eliminating the other ones, you get down to these 2. Then you'll look a little more critically at both of these versus potentially falling for the bait. So, and then also if you eliminate a choice, make sure to, you don't want to write X, because if you're doing this 36 times and then all these slashes, if you write 5 times 36 is 180. And if you write 180 slashes, if you actually take that time to do that, that might be 45 like a minute or something. And that's wasted time. So use a slash instead of an X. That's going to be half the amount of writing. And I do recommend doing this for every single question. Just write ABCDE once, not 36 times. That will take forever. And even if you're able to more or less remember this, still just putting on a page, it frees up your memory so you can just focus on the question. And it'll save time, so you don't have to remember which one you're having to keep track of. So, and then that's mostly it. I mean, for as far as I guess in terms of critical reasoning, the order in which the information is presented is not actually the order that you want to try solving the question. They give you the passage first, and then they give you the question after that. It's better to read the question first, because if you can identify what kind of question it is it strengthened, is it assumption, whatever, then you have a better chance, or a better sense of what you're looking for. And often, sometimes they give you information in the question stem that helps contextualize the passage anyway. So it's good to read the question stem first and then read the passage. And when you read the passage, definitely, what's the conclusion? Is this sentence just background information, or are they using it to reach some conclusion? Is it part of their argument? Think about what each sentence does. So there's the bold-faced question when they ask you, what does each part in bold do in the passage? It's good to kind of do that anyway for a passage in CR, to know kind of what each sentence does, because then that helps you to kind of look for, depending on the type of question, you might know which part to reread. And also it just helps to kind of frame the passage itself. What is the entire structure of the argument that they're presenting? So it's good to kind of be in bold-face mode anyway, of what is each sentence doing. Okay, so that's so for quant and verbal, those are the main kind of tips that I wanted to go into. And then let me pivot back to the screen, see if there's any questions. So let's see, we have, so we talked about RC. I did, yes, sir. What to do, no idea. I'm too confused about RC, CR, both not good. My vocabulary is not good. Oh yeah, vocabulary. That's a good point. So vocabulary itself can be something that takes time. So there are a lot of approaches to that. I mean, anytime dealing with a second language, vocabulary is like one of the first things that one of the biggest struggles. So one is literally every time you see a word, it's a good idea to look it up. I mean, whenever I went to Brazil, and I learned a little bit of Portuguese by literally just talking to people in chats, text messages, whatever. By every single word I would put in the translator and essentially memorize each word bit by bit, and then you'll see the more common ones immediately, and then everything after that you kind of just look up and we'll kind of gather. And if it's useful, you'll see it again. If it's not, you'll just forget it. So that's kind of a natural way to build your vocabulary. And just everyday conversational talking, that's good for the basic vocabulary. But in terms of getting some of the more advanced words, then it's good to engage with like academic articles, maybe read news articles, and literally look up every single word that you see. Or you can install a browser extension that, if you hover over the word, it tells you the definition. So there are extensions in your browser, your web browser, that helps. And also it's good to even just do vocabulary apps where you look at flashcards and just memorize words. However, there's a lot of, I forget how many words the English language has. Maybe it's like 500,000 or something. It's a few 100,000, whatever it is. But not all of those words are used. A lot of them are obsolete, and they're just in the dictionary, but they haven't really been used by anyone in any serious way in 100 years or something. So you don't want to just like pick up a dictionary and just randomly memorize different words, because that'll be a waste of time, because a lot of those words you'll never use. But instead, it's better to keep it grounded in actual words that you're encountering. So maybe in the official guide, as you read through it, the official guide for GMAT, that book, literally just every word you see that you don't understand, look that up. Because that'll be the vocabulary that you're going to see in the test. They're not using archaic, super academic, technical vocabulary. It'll just be practical vocabulary. So that'll give you a good idea of what to look at. And yeah, so vocabulary apps, but not words you're not going to actually use. Just keep it grounded to the actual GMAT. Speaking of which, a lot of study materials are not really, they kind of go outside the GMAT, and you want to be careful about that because that's a scope creep, which can end up taking way more time. So you want to keep it very grounded in GMAT materials, official GMAT materials. So that's true for vocabulary. It's also true for when you're doing homework and things. You want to be careful not to stray too far from GMAT related topics because it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of information. Okay, so and how much time can we develop base and CR? It really depends on where you're starting and what materials you're using. You may have a more specific question than that, which if you asked that, I could elaborate. But yeah, I mean, critical reasoning. So verbal is half the test. It's half your score, the 800 score. And critical reasoning is about 1/3 of your score. Maybe it's a little less. It depends on how it compares to your other scores. But I mean, how much time you should spend to CR depends on what your scores are. But so if for kind of a really crude approximation, whatever your verbal is, just divide that by 3 for critical reasoning. Of course, if your critical reasoning is much higher than your verbal, then than the rest of your verbal, then you can spend less time. But if it's lower, then you might want to spend slightly more time than 1/3. But just proportionate based on how your score compares to the rest of the verbal section. And then just remember that verbal is half your score. So where are we at? What's a better approach? Leaving question or guess if I have a few questions left by the end? Yeah, this is a really good question. And it's a fairly common scenario that many students will encounter. If let's say you're at the end, you have 5 questions left and you're kind of starting to run short on time. Well, it's kind of, prevention is the best medicine. It's best to try to avoid that scenario in the first place and just kind of be consistent from the beginning and maybe move on early on the test rather than spending too much time. Really stick to that 5 questions, 9 minutes thing. Even if you feel like you're rushing, still it's better to keep that consistent so that at the end you don't have a really short amount of time to answer many questions. So if let's say you're down to 5 questions, you're kind of short on time. Do you guess? Just leave it blank. I do not recommend totally skipping a question and just throwing it away. The danger in that is the question itself may be easy, and then you're just skipping it and then losing points on an easy one. It's better to do kind of a slightly more abbreviated approach. Like at least read the question and see, does this question make sense? Is it easy? What's my gut response? Can I answer it quickly? And if you can, it's better to just attempt it, even if it's a slightly more rushed attempt. If you can get it down to 2 choices, even 3 choices, the time trade-off is more than likely going to be worth it, especially if you were consistent in the earlier part of the test. But if you read the question, let's say it's a math question, you read it and you just have no idea what to do, just skip straight into the indirect methods and solve. Just plug in the numbers or using as choices, estimate, whatever it is you need to do. So let's see, where else are we? Yeah, basically, if you skip a question, make sure it's a difficult question that you're skipping. You don't want to skip an easy question. And then let's see. From GMAT is right. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what this question is. So an additional source we can prefer to boost vocabulary. Yeah, I mean, I may have answered that question, but maybe this was asked before I did. I think basically keep it concrete in just read news if it's in the target language, and specifically the official GMAT. Just use the vocabulary in the official GMAT books. That's usually going to be more than enough. if you're in a reading comprehension passage and it's about, or a critical reasoning passage that's about something you're unfamiliar with, you don't need technical language. Like you don't have to be an archaeologist and know these radiocarbon dating techniques, or you don't have to be a financial analyst if there's a passage about something related to that. You can pretty much whatever you need to know is going to be in the passage. They don't test any specialized knowledge, and any special vocabulary is usually going to be you can kind of determine it from the context. But if you need to build vocabulary, definitely use some vocabulary apps. But if you see a word that you've never seen in GMAT, don't worry about it. It's just going to be a waste of time. And then let's see, can we refer to LSAT prep material for the verbal section? Yes, you can. Although the questions are not quite the same. Well, there's no SC in the verbal, in the LSAT. So only for critical reasoning and reading comprehension. And I think the LSAT questions tend to be more difficult than the GMAT questions. So this might only be helpful if you're going for that top score. But if your verbal score is, let's say, in the 20s or 30s, I don't recommend using LSAT material because it's more difficult and it's more dense. The time per question is going to be a little different. And also, it's the questions themselves are slightly different. Even though there's a reading comprehension and a critical reasoning type of question in the LSAT, they don't test exactly the same things. They have a slightly different character. It would be better than not studying anything at all. But if you have a choice, it's better to study GMAT questions for GMAT because it's going to be closer to what you're actually doing. So we have this question, which materials do you recommend to practice? So that's a good question. And it really depends on what your starting score is, your background, and your target score. I will say that all the official GMAT materials are the best ones to study, but they are often not enough for most people or for many people. And students also might use them inefficiently. There's a finite number of official GMAT questions to study, and sometimes students will just kind of burn through them and not get the maximum value out of doing those questions. So it's better to, you want to think of each question as a mine, like you're extracting ore or gold from a mine. You don't want to just like kind of do a quick pass and then, there's still a lot of gold in that mine. You're already at that mine. You have all the equipment there. It's better to just keep mining and, until you reach that diminishing marginal returns point. Just go deeper in the questions. Really dissect each answer choice in verbal critical reasoning. So, if you're answering a question, maybe even if you get it right, you have it down to two choices. You don't have a good reason why. If you don't have a good reason to explain to someone else why this choice is better than that choice, it's just kind of, well, it just sounds right, or it's just kind of my intuition. That means you need to go deeper in that question and really, really pick apart, well, what about this answer choice what exactly makes it wrong? What can I tell a computer that it would be able to algorithmically decide that almost? Or how can I convince somebody else? Somebody else thinks this answer is C, but I think it's E. And I got the question right. Or, how do you convince a person that thinks it's C that it's C? Then by really making that explicit, you're able to essentially make the unconscious conscious. And that's going to be helpful in later questions because you can kind of do that in a more condensed way in the test, and you'll be less likely to fall for these approach. Be less likely to fall for whatever traps they built. They make an answer sound like it's correct, but it's not correct. How did they make it sound correct? Why did we think it was correct? Why did I make this mistake that I thought it was correct, but it wasn't? What about the language? Just being really explicit about that, and even writing it in your error log. What exactly in your spreadsheet you're going to save? Well, I thought it was this one because such and such, and then this is how they made that tricky, and this is how to avoid that. So yeah, in terms of which materials to recommend to use for practice, depends on where you are. You may need to use do some speed math stuff. You can look up basic, things like there's shortcuts, math shortcuts that you need to use. Sometimes even practicing for sentence correction, you can find a tutor to just maybe once a week. You write something, just have them correct your grammar. However, if they're not focused on GMAT, you don't want to stray too far in that direction because they may not know exactly what you need to focus on specifically. But it could be better than nothing. If your English is kind of okay, but you need to work on it a lot, that could be helpful for a lot of that. And then there are plenty of test prep companies that have materials. The closer you can stick to official GMAT materials, the better. But you can also work with some of that. There are also plenty of materials that aren't even commercially sold; they're just free materials. You can Google things like common logical flaws or debate tactics. That can actually help with your CR. You can kind of see what kind of strategies people use to try to fool people that that can be helpful for CR. And then for reading comprehension, it's good to learn speed reading, how to speed read. There are apps you can download that help with speed reading. There's one called, I think, Spritz, something like that just flashes words at you very quickly, and then you're able to process them a lot more quickly. There are all kinds of techniques for memory as well that you can apply to keeping track of things in GMAT. And then on a speed math, on a speed reading, it's good to the way that your eye moves is itself a limiting factor. So if you're moving from every single word to every single word, that actually can create more time and more decisions. The more decisions that your brain has to make, the more work that is, the more time that can take. So every time you have to move your eye from each word to each word, that actually adds up. So what you can do instead is kind of look at so wherever our eye is focused, we can actually see a little bit around that in the periphery of that. So rather than looking at every single word, you can kind of look at this word and then skip over to a few words down. And while you're looking at this word, you can see the word next to it and before it. And then while you're looking at this other word, you kind of see these. So you can make fewer motions with your eyes. There's all kinds of subtle things like that, psychological understanding how the brain works. That's really helpful for GMAT because this is a psychometric evaluation, and they have people psychologists and so on that they're using their expertise to help construct these questions and what they're trying to measure. So having some understanding of what the brain is doing in the context of tests is also pretty useful. And then lastly, we have one more question. Should I also do a mock test at the beginning, even when I know that I have a lot of weak areas? Of course, yeah, that's actually the very first thing you should do, is to take a test in the very beginning to just know exactly. The idea of being weak in certain areas, that's kind of subjective. There's an objective measure. Some people are perfectionists, and maybe they're actually starting with a 750, but they're just really tough on themselves, and then they think, oh yeah, I'm actually not very good at this thing. But then they take the test and they actually have a 750. So that would, you don't want to just be studying without a clear plan, especially if you're close to it. Or let's say you're starting off at 400, or it doesn't matter where you're starting, but it's always good to take a practice test, because knowing exactly where you are, that tells you what materials you need to study, what kind of approach you need to take, how much time you need to devote to the test, what's realistic, what's feasible or not. So sometimes students will they actually need 4 months to do the test, but they're starting, 2 months from their deadline. And it's good to know that in advance. I mean, it's good to know that very early on so you can plan accordingly. So, I mean, oftentimes even the decision to take the test can be even kind of, I wouldn't say spur of the moment, but somewhat last minute in that it's several months out, but maybe needed to be 6 months out, because then maybe a person has a lot of work obligations they have to do, so that they don't have time to really study that much. And it's better to know in the beginning. So yeah, everyone should take a test in the very, very beginning. And it should be an official GMAT test, not a test prep company test, because those aren't going to be the exact same quality types of questions. Those are mostly designed to kind of bait you into enlisting into the program and enroll you in the course or to hire tutoring, whatever. It's better than nothing, but take an official GMAT mock test from the MBA.com website and use that to get a sense of where you are. Don't use subjective evaluation. Definitely don't want to just doing some questions and kind of think, oh, I get this or I don't get this. It needs to be rooted in an actual practice test. And also on the flip side, when you do want to start your studies with an official practice test, but what you don't want to do is just take practice test after practice test after practice test, because a lot of students do that and then they burn through the practice tests and then they don't have official tests. I mean, realistically, MBA.com has 6 practice tests. In the official GMAT, you can take 5 tests in a year or a 365-day period and 8 times total forever. So that's 14 tests. That's plenty of tests. I mean, there's no reason to take a million tests. But you also don't want to burn through those, because students actually do that. I mean, I've worked with students who they did every diagnostic test. They've done 4 official GMATs, and they're just kind of at their last attempt. And that's not a position that you want to be in. And you don't have to be in, because there's plenty of materials to study. Basically, unless you're, let's say, 10 or 20 points within your target, it should be like 50 hours of study before you take your next practice test. Because realistically, you won't have gained that much. Like, let's say you take a practice test, and then you study 10 hours. I mean, you're not going to have learned that much in 10 hours. You'll have learned something, certainly. And you may even take a test and improve a little bit. But unless the first test was just kind of a low attempt and you had 10 hours of really just super focused study, just all the exact areas that you needed, and nothing more, there's some rare circumstance where people actually do get a large jump. Maybe they're just really good studiers. They did really good in school. But by and large, you want to do plenty of study in between tests and not just burn these tests. Even though there are other tests that test prep companies make, they're better than nothing. There's no substitute for the real thing. They're helpful. You definitely want to use them. But you don't want to just burn through. I mean, like GMAT Club has some practice tests. Those are good resources. But you don't want to just take a bunch of practice tests with no study in between. There needs to be, basically, when you do a question, let's say you're studying, let's say you're doing official GMAT questions. You want to do questions within a certain time limit. You want to time yourself. You want to have the error log. You want to do the question once. If you miss it, do it again. After you've figured out what you need to do, build all the strategies you need in that question into solving it within the time limit. Time yourself until you're able to reach that. You may need to do it the same question, 3 times before you reach that, sometimes even 5 times. But eventually you get there. If you plateau, maybe just, forget it and move on to the next one. Let's say you keep getting it 2 minutes 30, 2 minutes 30. Maybe it's just a difficult question. Or maybe there's just some core areas that you need to work on. It depends on the circumstance, but always time yourself. Do the questions at your ability. Not trying to do too much more difficult than wherever your score is, and build up all these core areas, make significant progress, and then take another practice test, maybe 50 hours of study. That might be a month. That might be, depends on how much time you're able to study. But because if you take a practice test and then you take another practice test and nothing changed, that can be demotivating, especially if you do that several times in a row. Then that might send the subconscious signal that, well, I'm not actually progressing. So what do I do? It's better to make significant strides, then take the practice test and see that 50-point jump or whatever it is, however many points you gain, and then repeat and build up plenty of skills in the meanwhile. That's far more motivating and more efficient. And then on the flip side, of course, you don't want to wait too long before a practice test. You don't want to have studied 300 hours or several months and no kind of metric. That's also not good either. But you also should be measuring yourself constantly as you go along doing the questions. You'll kind of get a sense of, are you improving based on your accuracy and how quickly you're able to answer the questions, the difficult level of questions that you're getting. Also, it's important to keep in mind that in the official guide books, the questions, they tend to kind of increase by difficulty. So you may, as you go work through the book, you may notice your accuracy is decreasing, the questions are taking longer. Well, that's not because you're doing worse. It's because the questions are more difficult. So the time per question by itself isn't enough to know, or your accuracy. You have to kind of weigh that they're getting more difficult as well. So it can be kind of challenging to assess your progress on the official guide. But for a baseline, if let's say that you were doing the easy parts in 30 seconds, a question in quant, your accuracy is pretty high. But then you work to the later parts. Let's say you're doing the questions at 60 seconds each in the middle part of the book, but your accuracy is almost the same. It's gone down a little bit. That's actually good. That's actually better than your performance in the first part, because the questions are more difficult. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, if there's any questions, feel free to add them in the comments now. Otherwise, you can just contact us. You can just go to dreamscore.com, and there's a chat bot. You can just kind of fill that out, get us your information. You can contact us and ask us any questions. I might build them into the next video. If you have questions that you want me to cover in the next video, or just questions about GMAT, whatever, we can do that next video. If you want study plans or just general help on where you are, you can tell us your situation, what you're doing. I mean, where you are and what you're trying to do, and we can give you some guidance there. And it'll be complimentary. And if you decide you want to do a course, we can help you with that too. So if that's it, I wish you the best in your studies and in your approach to round 2, or if you're just starting, I wish you a good beginning. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope you do well. And if you have questions, just reach out and we'll take care of you. Otherwise, we'll see you in GMAT Club, and have a good one.